So here we have a paper from the DIA, which is the Defense Intelligence Agency, Biological Effects of Electromagnetic Radiation, Radio Waves and Microwaves, Eurasian Communist Countries. So this is prepared by the US Army Medical Intelligence and Information Agency Office of the Surgeon General. Biological Effects of Electromagnetic Radiation, Radio Waves and Microwaves, Russian Communist Countries. Authors Mr. Ronald Adams, Dr. R. Williams. Data publication 1976 in March. Information cut-off date 10th of October 1975. So it's a Department of Defense intelligence document prepared by the US Army Medical Intelligence and Information Agency and approved by the Directorate for Scientific and Technical Intelligence of the Defense Intelligence Agency. So it's classified by DIA, but now it's obviously declassified. So the preface. The purpose of this review is to provide information necessary to assess human vulnerability, protection materials, and methods applicable to military operations. The study provides an insight on the current research capabilities of these countries. Information on trends is presented when feasible and supportable. The study discusses the biological effects of electromagnetic radiation in the radio and microwave ranges up through 300,000 MHz. It is not within the realm of this study to provide detailed descriptions of every laboratory experiment. Such data have been purposely omitted in favour of an analytical approach. An attempt has been made to identify the principal areas of research and to discuss the significance of experimental results. The information reported in the study has been drawn from scientific, medical, and military journals, intelligence reports, magazines, news items, books, and other publications. The information cut-off date for this study was 1st of October 1975, which is different to the date it says there, 10th of October 1975. Constructive criticism, comments, or suggested changes are encouraged and should be forwarded to the Defense Intelligence Agency, Washington, D.C. So in this, we have an introduction and the biological significance of radio waves and microwaves on the blood, cardiovascular system, cells, central nervous system, digestive system, glands, metabolism, reproduction, visual systems, internal and sound perception. Goes on to state some miscellaneous observations, discussion of research methodologies, safety precautions and standards, trends, conclusions and forecasts, and information gaps. So the summary. The thermal effects of electromagnetic radiation have been reasonably well established through experimental investigation. The non-thermal effects, however, remain a controversial issue between scientists in the West and in the Eurasian communist countries. The difficulties encountered in conclusively demonstrating the non-thermal effects of electromagnetic exposure are likely responsible for differences in exposure standards. Some standards are based largely on the demonstrable thermal effects, while others allow for possible non-thermal effects at subthermal intensities. The Eurasian communist countries are actively involved in evaluation of the biological significance of radio waves and microwaves. Most of the research being conducted involves animals or in vitro evaluations, but active programs of a retrospective nature designed to elucidate the effects on humans are also being conducted. The major system components or processes currently under study include the blood, the cardiovascular system, cells, the central nervous system, the digestive system, the glandular system, metabolic effects, and the reproductive and the visual systems. Other aspects of exposure are also being studied, but the limited number of reports uncovered makes assessment of the importance placed upon this research impossible. These lesser reported research areas include non-thermal effects, immunological studies, and use of radio waves for functional control of organ systems. No unusual devices or measures for protection from radio wave exposure were noted, but a continued stress upon personnel protection in occupational situations was apparent. Here, protective goggles and clothing are recommended when working in regions of microwave radiation. Although some differences in standards remain between the various communist countries and between military and civilian standards, the communist standards remain and much more stringent than those of the West. An exception to this may be Poland, where a recent relaxation of their standards has occurred. This is the first significant shift of an East European country away from the standard first set by the USSR in 1958. If the more advanced nations of the West are strict in the enforcement of stringent exposure standards, there could be unfavourable effects on industrial output and military functions. The Eurasian communist countries could, on the other hand, give lip service to strict standards, but allow their military to operate without restriction and thereby gain the advantage in electronic warfare techniques and the development of anti-personnel applications. The potential for the development of a number of multi-personnel applications is suggested by the research published in the USSR, East Europe and the West. Sounds and possibly even words which appear to be originating intracranially can be induced by signal modulation at very low average power densities. Combinations of frequencies and other signal characteristics is to produce other neurological effects may be feasible in several years. The possibility of inducing metabolic diseases is also suggested. Animal experiments reported in the open literature have demonstrated the use of low-level microwave signals to produce death by heart seizure or by neurological pathologies resulting from breaching of the blood-brain barrier. As may be expected, the bulk of the research being done in this area is in the USSR. However, a notable volume is also being produced by Poland, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Romania, and Hungary. Western scientists have followed the Soviet research efforts on the biological effects of microwaves, have expressed a variety of reactions ranging from disbelief to passive acceptance. The overall impact of current Soviet work is not overly significant, at least on their civilian sector. One possible exception may be their studies of the central nervous system, where some interesting work is being done. Elsewhere, most of their work tends to be outdated. Some of their experiments cannot be duplicated, and others are of doubtful credibility. No real new developments or fresh approaches have been identified. Nevertheless, a large volume of material continues to be published on the effects of radio waves and microwaves on biological systems, indicating a fairly high degree of interest and a genuine desire to pursue these investigations. No significant research and development has been identified that could be related to work in this field in the People's Republic of China, North Korea, and North Vietnam. So I wanted to talk about this. The potential for the development of a number of anti-personnel applications is suggested by the research published in the USSR, East Europe and the West. Sounds, and possibly even words, which appear to be originating intracranially, can be induced by signal modulation at very low average power densities. Find that fascinating. Combinations of frequencies and other signal characteristics to produce other neurological effects may be feasible in several years. The possibility of inducing metabolic diseases is also suggested. Animal experiments reported in the open literature have demonstrated the use of low-level microwave signals to produce death by heart seizure or by neurological pathologies resulting from breaching of the blood-brain barrier. So this shows you that a lot of research, even by this point, 1976, had been done on how to affect the human biological system as a weapon to do damage to organs, to control whether you live or die, and or to input sounds and possibly even words into your head using low-level signals. So that reminds me, I've got a very good book which I've been reading recently, and that talks about putting words in your head as well. So I'm just going to get that. So I'll tell you what it is after, what the book is, but I'll just read this extract. Frey found that human subjects exposed to 1310 MHz and 2982 MHz microwaves at average power densities of 0.4 to 2 milliwatts per centimeter squared perceived auditory sensations described as buzzing or knocking sounds. The peak power densities were on the order of 200 to 300 milliwatts per centimeter squared, and the pulse repetition frequencies varied from 200 to 400 Hz. Frey referred to this auditory phenomenon as the RF radio frequency sound. The sensation occurred instantaneously at average incident power densities well below that necessary for known biological damage, and appeared to originate from within or near the back of the head. There were important ramifications to Frey's discovery. In his paper, Human Auditory System Response to Modulated Electromagnetic Energy, Frey explained how voices can be beamed directly into an individual's head. Among other areas of research, Frey also delved into the induction of heart seizures by beamed electromagnetics. Other Pandora personnel included Operation Paperclip Nazis, like Dr. Dietrich Beischer, who irradiated 7,000 Navy crewmen with dangerous levels of radiation at the Naval Aerospace Research Laboratory in Pensacola, Florida. Beischer simply disappeared in 1977, with records of his employment and his existence expunged. Spanish researchers maintain that brain implant specialist Dr. Jose Delgado was also involved in Pandora. In 1972, the Department of the Army released a report titled Controlled Offensive Behavior, USSR, documenting 500 Russian studies of the use of super high frequency electromagnetic oscillations. SHF, super high frequency, may be used as a technique for altering human behavior, the report stated. Lethal and non-lethal effects have been shown to exist. In certain non-lethal exposures, definite behavioral changes have occurred. In the same year, the US Army Mobility Equipment Research and Development Center released a study titled Analysis of Microwaves for Barrier Warfare. The report discussed the use of truck-portable microwave broadcasting systems that would be used to irradiate and immobilize people, and suggested that with the current state of armament there was no way of protecting against the use of such a system. At about the same, electronics engineer Tom Jaski was conducting experimentation using a low-power oscillator broadcasting at 3 to 600 MHz to irradiate subjects. In repeated trials, subjects were able to detect the electromagnetic sweeps and at these individual frequencies, the same subjects announced having experienced pulsing sensations in the brain, ringing in the ears, and an odd desire to bite the experimenters. As research in mind control progressed, the potential of directly and precisely influencing the human brain with microwaves became apparent. Technologies whereby emotions, messages, and subliminal commands could be beamed directly to the brain of unwitting subjects were researched by both the American and Soviet governments. Among many other projects, the Department of Defense funded work of J.F. Shapitz, who in 1974 proposed the use of radio broadcasting in conjunction with hypnotic control. In this investigation, Shapitz wrote, "It will be shown that the spoken word of the hypnotist may be conveyed by modulate electromagnetic energy directly into the subconscious parts of the human brain, without employing any technical devices for receiving or transcoding the messages, and without the person exposed to such influence having a chance to control the information input consciously." The second experiment was to be the implanting of hypnotic suggestions for simple acts, like leaving the lab to buy some particular item, which were to be triggered by suggested time, spoken word, or sight. Triggered is an important word, by the way. Have to remember that one. Subjects were to be interviewed later. It may be expected that they rationalize their behavior and consider it to be undertaken out of their own free will. The results of Shapitz's experimentation have never been released to the public. I wonder why. In 1978, Dr. Andrew Mikrovsky wrote that potentially almost anything could be inserted into the target brain-mind systems, and such insertions would be processed by the biosystems as internally generated data or effects. Words, phrases, images, sensations, and emotions could be directly inserted and experienced in the biological targets as internal states, codes, emotions, thoughts, and ideas. Now, if you want to read more about that, it's an excellent book, Engineering Human Consciousness, Mass Control. That's the other way around, actually. Mass Control, Engineering Human Consciousness. And that's by Jim Keith. So I thought that fitted directly with this, because it just mentions it here, but Jim Keith really expands it out. Okay. And the reason I read that as well is because all these antennas are on kicking around, and do we really not think that these, especially as they're opening the spectrum from 0 to 300 gigahertz, do not people en masse or individually or select people could be affected or targeted? The point is, the possibility is there, so you can't rule it out. So the introduction. The effects of radio waves and microwaves on biological systems have traditionally been separated into two basic classifications. 1, thermal effects, and 2, non-thermal effects. The thermal effects are widely recognized and the mechanism of action reasonably well understood. Non-thermal effects, however, are controversial, since the mechanisms involved are not clearly understood. Soviet and East European scientists believe that biological side effects occur at power densities that are too low to produce obvious thermal effects. Such effects have been questioned in the West because experimental evidence, obtained largely in US laboratories, does not corroborate occurrence of non-thermal side effects. Divergences in opinion between Block and Western researchers concerning the effects of microwave radiation are the result of non-standardized research protocols and materials. In addition, mechanisms underlying observed biological effects are at present poorly understood by any of the world's scientists engaged in microwave research. The exchange of scientific information on microwave hazards has increased greatly since the active participation of Soviet, Czechoslovak and Polish scientists in the International Symposium on Biological Effects and Health Hazards of Microwave Radiation in Warsaw in October 1973. It is now generally agreed that biological systems irradiated with electromagnetic waves in the radio wave and microwave frequency ranges 1 kHz to more than that of 10 to the power 5 MHz absorb varying amounts of energy depending on the irradiation frequencies and the physical properties of the system. Typically, however, 40 to 50% of the incident energy is absorbed by the biological system and the remainder reflected. In reality, only the shorter wavelengths represent any appreciable hazard as a result of thermal heating. Radiation fields in the microwave range vary in wavelength from about 1 meter to very short wavelengths on the order of a millimeter. The depth of penetration of the waves is also variable and again depends on the frequency, wave polarization, and the physical properties of the system, i.e. dielectric and geometric, but typical penetrations are on the order of 1/10 of the wavelength. Therefore, very short waves are absorbed primarily by the skin, while long wavelengths penetrate to much greater depths. The degree of heating appears to be a function of the water content of the tissue and probably results from oscillations of water molecules or dipoles. Another possibility is a resonance absorption of energy by protein molecules of the cell. As might be expected, the actual damages resulting from a given exposure are functions of the thermal, regulatory, and active adaptation processes of the organ or animal. Less vascularized tissues are more susceptible to thermal damage because of a poorer ability to dissipate the heat. Therefore, crystalline lens damage or cataract formation may be observed. Many techniques and indices have been employed to study the effects of irradiation on biological systems. These include body weight, biochemical studies, cardiovascular studies, CNS effects, including conditioned and unconditioned reflexes, electrophysiological measurements, fertility and mutation studies, histology and pathology studies, metabolic studies, temperature. While these and other experimental studies have been conducted on animal and cellular models, knowledge regarding human exposure has been almost exclusively obtained retrospectively. Well, that hasn't changed, has it? Accordingly, information regarding the amount and or portion of the body exposed, field intensities and duration of exposure are usually ill-defined. As can be seen from the above, quantitation of the biological responses to electromagnetic exposure is a very complex problem because of the wide frequency spectrum, the large number of physical and biological variables, and the interrelationships of those variables. Factors requiring consideration include the frequency, intensity, waveform, pulsed, CW or modulated, configuration of the body, its orientation with respect to the source, portion of the body irradiated, exposure time intensity factors, environmental conditions, temperature, humidity and air currents, and shielding. Other complicating factors include the subject's state of health and previous or concomitant medication. In addition to the above factors, the animal species used and its comparative relation to man is important. Accordingly, experimental results from animals cannot easily be extrapolated. and assumed to apply to human exposure because of size differences relative to exposure wavelength, which can markedly influence the system or organ being damaged. With those complicating factors in mind, the evaluation contained in this report was undertaken. The data presented were obtained from the sources outlined in the preface and sometimes contained insufficient information to make absolute decisions regarding their significance. The sources were, however, indicative of the types of effects being reported and suggested those areas of research being emphasized, thereby permitting assessment of recent Eurasian communist attempts to define the biological effects of radio waves and microwaves. Now, I find that very interesting, how these science papers that we see, even today, in the last decade or two, only use supposedly one of the variables of microwave radiation, without pulsing most of the time, and not taking into account any of the other factors seen here. I mean, this is quite a good summary, actually, of how complicated it can be. So why then, and also the extrapolation from animals to humans, so why bother funding a 20 year NTP study on rats when it can't be extrapolated to humans? And they said this back in 1976. It just seems like a bit odd to put so much money and time and effort into something that you know can't be used to evaluate harm to a human being. And the experiments using microwaves are done in pristine conditions, with no respect to underlying health issues, or air currents, humidity, temperature, and they generally do like whole body exposure of one frequency, which is just not the case in real life. You're getting hit by multiple sources, many different frequencies, lots of different modulations. You've got cell towers positioned around you, all sending different pulses. And you've got Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, smartphones, if you have them in your house. If you don't, your neighbour does. So for them to come out and say, oh, non-thermal doesn't affect you, again, they're just taking one thing out of the myriad of things described here, and I'll highlight that. You do well to read through that list and bear that in mind when you're reading a paper as well. Anyway, so that's the introduction, and in the next video I'll be doing section 2 and continuing on. Okay, thanks.